Hello and welcome. My name is Bernard Lamberel and I'm the author of The Covenant on the Origin of the Abrahamic Faith by Means of Deification, a historical essay in which I argue that Abraham did exist and made a covenant not with a god, but with a king, a Mesopotamian king, whose memory was deified after his death, and the descendants would have elevated to the rank of deity and to the point where we call him now Yahweh. In this video, we're going to try to find who that Lord might be that has made a covenant with Abraham. Because again, if that Lord existed, and if the story is indeed to be understood as a secular story, then there has to be traces in history of who that Lord might be. And in the book, I do undergo a number of comparison and try to situate and try to look at the big picture to start with and try to kind of zoom down until we pinpoint one actual king who I believe might have been Abraham's Lord. So in this video, I'm going to give you the answer, and I'm just going to summarize some of the key ideas as to why I believe this king was Abraham's Lord. In the book, we go into a lot more details to justify and offer evidence suggesting that this was indeed the case. But for you, I will reveal that name immediately. Stay tuned. King Hammurabi. So I believe that Abraham made a covenant with King Hammurabi. King Hammurabi is a great lawgiver, one of the first lawgiver and the first of a dynasty of establishing a dynasty across the entire Mesopotamia, all the way up north. To current knowledge, he didn't extend his sphere of influence over Canaan, but nothing says he didn't. As we'll see, there's a lot of indication suggesting he might be the guy. Obviously, I could be wrong, and I guess future will tell us. But I believe there's a number of reasons. First one is looking at the time frame and the history of Hammurabi and what we know about this king. In the Bible, we see that the story of Abraham comes after the Tower of Babel, the story of the Tower of Babel. Now, most scholars would agree that the Tower of Babel in the Bible actually refers to a ziggurat in Mesopotamia. And ziggurats were kind of step pyramids. And the Ziggurat of Ur is probably one of the oldest ziggurat and the first one. And so if the story of Abraham came after the Tower of Babel, then that tower must have been up by then. So if we look at history, the ziggurat, the first ziggurat, the Ziggurat of Ur, which was built at least 2,000 years before the Common Era. Now, when we look at the history of King Hammurabi, his ancestors have defeated Ibisin in 2028 before Christ. And when you add up the generations of kings between Ibisin and Hammurabi, you find the exact same history on Abraham's side. So when you look at the ancestors of Abraham from Sem, and just take the Bible at face value, you have 390 years before Sem and Abraham. Now, if you put Abraham where Jewish tradition says, which would have been a contemporary to Hammurabi, 390 years before that, there was no ziggurat. But if you multiply by 0.6, like we saw earlier, then Sem and Ibisin actually match. and all the descendants of Hammurabi and Abraham allow us to have both contemporary. Now, during the reign of Hammurabi, there's a very, very tiny window, and that's another reason that makes me think Hammurabi is the right candidate, because there is a window in time that allows both Abraham and Hammurabi to meet, and that is just before King Hammurabi would have rised to full power, and so he would have been a smaller king than Kedorlaomer, which was leading the punitive campaign against Sodom. And so King Hammerfell, which I believe is King Hammurabi, would have been able to take part in this punitive campaign. And again, when we look at the life of Abraham and Hammurabi, and I go in detail in the book, we can see that there's one moment in history where we can align the two. And that would set the War of King in 1765, before the Common Era. Now, if Abraham was born a year later or a year before, or same thing with King Hammurabi, this match would not be possible. And I explain that again in detail in the book. Now, there's alternative information such as dendrochronology. So dendrochronology is the study of tree rings on ancient wood. So we find ancient logs of woods, dating 2,000-year-old logs, and that are found on archaeological sites. Cut them, slice them, and then the rate of growth of the tree, if it was a drought year, the rings would be very small. If there was a wet and a better year, the tree rings would be wider. And so it creates a unique pattern of growth. But that pattern of growth is the same across different woods that have lived at different times. So if this tree has 200 rings, then life that has a lifespan of 200 years, another tree that was started growing around here would have the same rings to start with. And so when you align these logs and you cut slices, you can rebuild a complete history of the climate of the region. And so the Cornell University specializes in this type of work, and the data we have for this period of time, so for the period of time of King Hammurabi, allows us to see that exactly in this period of time leading up to 1765 was the driest period in time, which would correspond to the drought that pushed Abraham into Egypt, and as he returns from Egypt, separates with Lot, and then the punitive campaign a year later took place. And so this would be the time that would also match our story. Now, again, if everything that happens in the story of Abraham, the birth of Ishmael, the birth of Isaac, etc., all this can take place in the current, in what we know of King Hammurabi. And again, I go into detail to show that all these things can happen, and King Hammurabi actually dies shortly after Isaac is born. Refer to the book for the details. This is just a high-level executive summary here. But there is an important story of Joseph in Egypt as well. And I believe that the descendants of Abraham from Joseph were the Hyksos kings who ruled Egypt. We know they came from the region of Canaan. They were Amorites. Here are some Hyksos important figures: Jacob Her, Chianset, Yanesi, Apepi, Aknenre, Kamudi. So these were important Hyksos kings. Now, on the patriarchs, we have Jacob. Some people have pointed to the fact that perhaps Jacob Her and Jacob would be the same name, the same person. But just a name is not evidence. However, nobody has suggested that Seth and Joseph could be the same. And Seth essentially ruled Egypt and became a very important ruler. He's one of the most important, he is the most important Hyksos king to have ruled over Egypt, Seth. He's typically referred as Hian. He's known as Hian, but some Egyptologists, including Rayolt, suggest that perhaps his second name was Seth. And so, and the K in Egyptian is, you don't really pronounce it. So what you have is Seth, which is very similar to Yosef. Now, Yosef had a son called Manasseh, and Manasseh was supposed to inherit in the Bible, but Jacob decided that it would be Ephraim. Seth had a son, Yanesi, that was expected to inherit the throne, and yet Apepik-Akenen-Re inherited, and we don't really know why. But we have a parallel here, not only between the names, Yanesi, Manasseh, Seth, Yosef, but also in their story. Apepik-Akenen-Re means the power of Re. Ephraim, in Hebrew is the face, which also indicates angriness or power. And Ra could be the same Re, so Re or Ra is the same Egyptian god. So here we have a reference to the power of Re on both sides. And then Kamudi is the last Hyksos king to have been expulsed out of Egypt. And basically we have, in the patriarchs, we have Shemitah that could potentially fit this name. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are some texts that are referred to in some documents with archaeological digs at Shechem, Tel Balata, from UNESCO, that indicates there are possible traces of Hyksos in Shechem. So when the Hyksos kings were expulsed from Egypt, they might have found refuge in Shechem, and where the temple of Baal Berith had been established already. Now, again, if Abraham and Hammurabi were contemporaries, then by adding the generations of the descendants of Abraham in the Bible, so you add all the years and of the generations from Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, etc., they end at the end of the Hyksos. So when the Hyksos were expulsed out of Egypt, begins the time when the Israelites were slaves in Egypt. Again, we have to multiply all the dates by 0.6, as we've seen earlier. And then, as soon as they're no longer slaves in Egypt, if you multiply everything by 0.6, then we fall right into the Battle of Kadesh and the Exodus. And then, essentially the amount of time for the Exodus to the Temple of Solomon. So again, using the 0.6 multiplier allows us to set Abraham exactly in the reign of Hammurabi. So we saw earlier how he could be from Ibisin and the descendants of Hammurabi and after the Ziggurat, but also from Temple of Solomon up. So again, we kind of have a dual match pointing to the period of King Hammurabi. Now, in terms of Exodus, so there's multiple ways in the Bible to calculate the date of the Exodus. But whether you take it from the number of years that the children of Israel were slaves in Egypt, so 400 or 430 years, and if you assume they were slaves after the Hyksos were booted out, and that's when Egypt became, when Canaan, I should say, became a vassal state of Egypt, then that would bring us to around 1100. Now, from the Temple of Solomon, if you were to go back 480 years, as the Bible says, you would get somewhere to 1400. None of these dates match Ramses II, which is supposed or understood to be the king of the Exodus. And again, most scholars looking into the story of the Exodus, even if they acknowledge that the dates are all wrong, do believe that if an Exodus happened, no matter the scale of that Exodus, it would have taken place under Ramses II or his son. Now, if you multiply by 0.6 those two dates, both dates point exactly to the Battle of Kadesh. And the Battle of Kadesh is probably one of the most important battle in history between Egypt and the Hittites. They were both fighting. So again, at the time, Egypt was extending. Canaan was a province of Egypt that was extending all the way to Turkey. And the Hittites were modern-day Turkey. And Kadesh is kind of on the Orontes River and was a point of contention. There's thousands and thousands of chariots, and the battle lasted, over a decade. But even in the end, nobody won the battle. Everybody got exhausted, and they signed a peace treaty. And that was the first known peace treaty in history. Came from the Battle of Kadesh. Now, what's very interesting is that Ramses II was the pharaoh of the Battle of Kadesh. And to celebrate his not loss, which I guess is not a victory either because it's a peace treaty, but to celebrate the end of the battle, and obviously everybody took the side that they won, there's a poem that is called the Poem of Pentaur that you can find on the Luxor today in Egypt. And the Poem of Pentaur has some very important similarities to the story of Exodus 14, which is the Red Sea or the Reed Sea, depending how you interpret it. So we know that the story Exodus 14 is this probably one of the most memorable story of the Bible, where Moses extends his arm and opens the water and allows the Israelites to cross the Red Sea, and Pharaoh and his chariots are drowned. Now, in the Poem of Pentaur, we have exactly the same key ideas between the Poem of Pentaur and the Exodus. And the first key idea is that in both texts, we have Pharaoh's heart hardens. He lifts up an army and chariots to pursue the opponents. It's the same thing in Exodus. Now, the only difference is that in the case of the Poem of Pentaur, the Lord is Ramses II. In the case of the Israelites and the Exodus, the Lord is Yahweh. So, another key idea is Pharaoh positioned his troops to the north. The opponents are hiding. The enemies fall in the water and drown. Their chariots tumble. They all died. They are afraid and beg the Lord to save their lives. Halt, stand still. The Lord will fight alone. And in the morning, those who had fought with him were consumed by fire, and the enemies beg for mercy. So you can take a look at Exodus 14 and just find online the Poem of Pentaur. It's a much longer text, but you're able to identify those key ideas in both texts, and then they appear in the same order. So, once again, when you look at the chronology and you add up all the dates in the Old Testament, you will find that the story actually match what we know of history. From Abraham having made a covenant with King Hammurabi, and again, in the book, I go into a much greater detail to explain how this might have happened. I don't pretend that this is any kind of argumentation. It's more of a presentation and a summary of the data that is presented in the book, but it gives you a sense of the work and where it's coming from. In the next video, we're going to wrap this up and going to talk a little bit about how did we go from this story of a man making a covenant with another man, how did that evolve into the faith we have today? What evidence do we have for that? And a quick conclusion. So thanks again, and see you in a bit.